Every winter, somewhere between 17,000 and 19,000 people die in Japan from something called heat shock. Not on a mountain, not in a blizzard, in their own bathrooms. An elderly person walks from a heated living room into an unheated hallway, steps into a scalding bathtub, and the sudden temperature swing triggers a stroke or a heart attack. In 2023 alone, over 6,000 seniors drowned in household bathtubs across the country. That is nearly 3 times the number of people who died in traffic accidents that same year. The Japanese government now publishes a heat shock forecast every winter, the same way it publishes weather warnings. Except the danger is not outside, it is inside people's own homes. Then, in a mountain valley, about 250 kilometers northwest of Tokyo, a collection of farmhouses built centuries ago sits buried under snowdrifts taller than a grown adult. Shirakawa-go gets an average of 36 feet of snowfall every year. The winters are brutal, isolated, and long. Snow buries the roads, it buries the fences, it buries the lower windows of the houses themselves. And inside those farmhouses, built without a single nail, heated by nothing more than an open fire pit in the floor, the air stays warm enough to raise silkworms on the upper floors. Then, on a winter night in 2024, a man in a modern Tokyo apartment turned on his kerosene heater and waited 45 minutes for his living room to climb from 6 degrees Celsius to 10. Meanwhile, a 300-year-old farmhouse made of wood, rope, and grass was keeping its occupants comfortable in a valley that gets more snow than most ski resorts on the planet. So how did farmers in the 1600s build homes that handle winter better than apartments built last year? The answer is one of the strangest engineering stories in architectural history. And it starts with a roof shaped like a prayer. The farmhouses of Shirakawa-go are called gasshō-zukuri, which translates to constructed like hands in prayer. Stand in front of one, and the name makes immediate sense. The roofline rises in a steep triangle that looks exactly like 2 palms pressed together, fingertips pointing toward the sky. The resemblance to a Buddhist monk's praying hands is so obvious that historians believe the name has been in common use since at least the 1200s. The village itself appears in the diary of a Kyoto aristocrat around 1176. These houses belong to a broader family of Japanese architecture called minka, meaning housing for the people. They were not palaces, they were not temples. They were built by and for farmers, artisans, and merchants living in one of the most punishing climates in Japan. The Sho River Valley, where Shirakawa-go sits, is a high-altitude basin surrounded by mountains on every side. The temperature regularly drops 10 degrees Celsius below the nearest lowland city. And between November and March, the snow does not stop. The valley becomes so isolated during winter that for centuries, the villages were effectively cut off from the rest of Japan for months at a time. Some historians believe the original settlers were survivors of the Taira clan, a powerful samurai family nearly wiped out by the rival Genji in the 12th century. They fled into the mountains and stayed, building a way of life around the one resource the valley offered in abundance: snow. The first thing the builders got right was the angle. Gasshō-zukuri roofs pitch between 60 and 70 degrees, far steeper than almost any residential structure anywhere else in the world. At that angle, snow cannot accumulate the way it would on a shallow roof. It slides. The steep face sheds snow under its own weight before the load can build up enough to crush the frame underneath. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the genius of the gasshō-zukuri roof is not just the angle, it is the material. The thatch on these roofs is not a thin layer of straw tossed over some planks. It is a precision-layered composite, 80 to 91 centimeters thick. That is roughly 3 feet of insulation sitting between the household and the sky. The layering follows a specific order. A 25mm hemp base goes down first, then 20 centimeters of rice straw, then 25 centimeters of water reed, and then a primary layer of miscanthus grass on top. Each material serves a different structural and insulating purpose, and together they create a barrier that keeps heat in during winter and blocks it out during summer. The principal rafters that hold this roof up are massive. Each one is an 11-meter timber with a 30-centimeter cross-section, and they form the A-frame skeleton of the entire house. The Sasu structural system, which is specific to gasshō-zukuri, eliminates vertical roof supports entirely. There are no posts running through the interior of the roof space. Instead, the diagonal braces distribute the weight of the thatch and the snow across the frame, creating a vast, open interior volume that stretches several stories high. And here is the detail that would matter more than anyone realized at the time. Not a single metal fastener holds any of it together. The entire structure relies on wooden joinery, mortise and tenon connections, and binding made from hemp rope and flexible witch hazel withes called nisawa. This is not a cost-cutting measure. It is a deliberate engineering choice. Because a rigid frame loaded with several tons of wet snow would snap, a flexible one bends. The gasshō-zukuri house sways and flexes under load instead of cracking, and the same flexibility that handles snow also handles earthquakes. Some of these houses have stood for over 250 years in a seismically active region, and the lack of nails is the reason they are still standing. The Wada house, the largest surviving gasshō-zukuri structure, measures 25 meters by 13 meters. The Kanda house, built in 1850, was specifically designed to demonstrate earthquake resistance through its joinery. In the village of Ainokura, in the neighboring Gokayama Valley, 20 gasshō-zukuri houses still stand, the oldest of them dating back over 350 years. But a steep, thick roof only solves half the problem. Snow does not care how well insulated your ceiling is if your heating system cannot keep the rooms below it warm. And the gasshō-zukuri builders did not have furnaces. They did not have radiators or forced air or electric baseboards. They had an open fire pit built into the floor, and somehow that was enough. The Irori is a traditional Japanese sunken hearth. Picture a square pit, about 1 meter across, lined with stone and cut directly into the wooden floor. Above it hangs an adjustable pot hook called a jizaikagi, usually an iron rod inside a bamboo tube with a lever shaped like a fish that raises and lowers a suspended kettle. You sit around the Irori on the floor. You cook on it. You boil water for tea. You grill fish and dry your clothes near it. And at night, the embers hold just enough heat to keep the room from freezing while the family sleeps. The Irori was the physical and social center of the household. Where you sat around it indicated your place in the family hierarchy. Guests took the seat of honor farthest from the entrance. The head of the household sat nearest the kitchen. Everyone else arranged themselves according to rank, and these positions rarely changed across a lifetime. In most old Japanese homes, the Irori was the only source of heat. And in a gasshō-zukuri house, the Irori does something that no other heating system in the world replicates quite the same way. It heats the house, and it also preserves the house. The two functions are completely inseparable. When the charcoal and wood in the Irori burn, the smoke does not exit through a chimney. There is no chimney. The smoke rises from the hearth, passes through a latticed wooden floor above, continues up through the attic space, and eventually filters out through the thick thatch roof overhead. The gasshō-zukuri house is not vented. The smoke is the ventilation. And that seems like it should be a problem, but it is actually the most elegant part of the entire design. The rising smoke does 3 things at once. First, it dries the massive timber beams and the thatch above, preventing the rot and fungal growth that would otherwise destroy a wooden structure in a wet mountain climate. Second, the tar in the smoke coats the wood and the underside of the thatch, making both insect-resistant and waterproof. Bugs will not bore into beams caked in creosote. Fungus cannot colonize wood that is perpetually dried and smoked. And third, the warm air rising from the Irori circulates through the entire vertical volume of the house, heating the upper floors without any mechanical system at all. You cannot have a functioning Irori without a thatched roof. And you cannot have a functioning thatched roof without an Irori. The two are a symbiotic pair. The fire preserves the roof that insulates the fire. Remove one and the other fails. Now, the Irori had its costs. The smoke caused eye disease over long exposure. Soot accumulated on every interior surface. An American anthropologist named John B. Cornell, who studied village life in Okama Prefecture in the early 1950s, wrote about how the interior beams of these houses were caked with soot that incessantly showers down. The Irori was not a perfect system, but it was a system that kept a wooden house standing and warm for centuries in a valley that gets more snow than most ski resorts on the planet. And the builders went further than just survival. They turned the heat into an industry. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because gasshō-zukuri houses were not just homes, they were factories. The enormous attic space created by the steep A-frame roof was not wasted square footage. The farmers of Shirakawa-go turned it into something nobody outside the valley would have expected. They used it for sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms. Silk was a valuable commodity, and the mountain villages that could produce it had an economic lifeline that went far beyond subsistence farming. But silkworms are finicky creatures. They are extremely sensitive to temperature and humidity. They need warmth but not heat, moisture but not dampness, and airflow but not drafts. Get the balance wrong, and the entire crop dies. The attic of a gasshō-zukuri house provided all of this naturally, without a single mechanical device. The heat from the Irori on the ground floor rose through the latticed wooden floors into the attic levels, keeping the silkworm beds warm through the alpine winter. The thick thatch overhead insulated the space from the cold outside and kept it from overheating in summer. Windows cut into the gable ends at the peaks of the roof provided light and ventilation. The entire upper structure functioned as a climate-controlled production facility centuries before anyone used that term. Building a separate structure for the silkworms would have meant sacrificing valuable farmland. It would also have meant one more roof to clear of snow during the winter, which was already a back-breaking task. By integrating the silkworm operation into the house itself, the farmers solved both problems at once. The house was the shelter, the workshop, and the business, all heated by the same fire pit in the floor. And in some villages in the neighboring Gokama Valley, the space beneath the ground floor was used for something even more surprising: nitra production, a key ingredient in gunpowder. The gasshō-zukuri house was shelter, silk factory, and munitions workshop all in one frame. If you're finding this useful, consider subscribing. I cover stories like this every week, the kind of history that hides behind buildings, landscapes, and systems most people never think twice about. So far, we have a house with a self-shedding roof, a self-preserving heating system, and a built-in factory. That alone is remarkable for a structure designed by farmers in a pre-industrial mountain valley. But the most extraordinary part of the gasshō-zukuri story is not the engineering. It is the social system that made the engineering possible. A gasshō-zukuri roof does not last forever. The thatch wears down, rain and snow batter it, and every 20 to 30 years, the entire roof needs to be stripped and replaced. This is not a weekend project. Re-thatching a gasshō-zukuri roof is a colossal job. Tons of old thatch come off. Tons of new miscanthus grass go on. The house is completely exposed to the elements while the work is underway, and because a storm could destroy the exposed timber frame, the job has to be finished before sundown. All of it, in one day. And doing it requires somewhere between 100 and 200 people, all working at the same time. The most experienced craftsmen work on the roof itself, layering and shaping the thatch. Younger workers haul bundles of grass up from the ground. Others clear debris, prepare tools, or carry supplies. And each house in the village maintains its own private field of Suzuki grass, grown specifically to provide the raw material for its own future roof. No single family could manage this alone. And in a remote mountain valley with no outside labor to hire, the only option was each other. The system they developed is called Yui, written with the Japanese character for binding or joining. Yui is an agreement of strict mutual aid among villagers. When your neighbor's roof needs re-thatching, you show up. You might haul bundles of miscanthus grass. You might climb onto the roof and lay thatch alongside the senior craftsman. You might prepare food for the workers or clean up the site. And when your roof needs replacing in 20 years, they show up for you. Every participant's contribution is recorded in a booklet called a Yui-cho. Not just the labor, but the materials each family provided, the equipment they brought, and even the number of sake bottles they supplied for the Naorai feast held after the job was done. The record keeping is meticulous because the system depends on fairness. If someone takes more than they give, the entire social contract frays. The oldest Yui-cho still in existence dates to 1792, proving that this cooperative system has been operating continuously for over 230 years. And it is not just a historical artifact. Yui is still practiced in Shirakawa-go today. When a roof needs replacing, the village gathers just as they have for centuries. Yui did not emerge from idealism. It emerged from necessity. The villages in the Sho River Valley were functionally cut off from the outside world for months every winter. The snow blocked the mountain passes. No supplies came in. No one left. For centuries, these were closed communities where moving away was practically unheard of, and moving in from outside was nearly as rare. In that isolation, mutual dependence was not a philosophy. It was survival. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't, because Yui did more than maintain roofs. It maintained the entire village. The same cooperative structure extended to rice planting, harvesting, weeding, firewood chopping, weddings, and funerals. The thatching was the most visible expression of a social fabric that touched every part of daily life. Without it, no single family could have survived the winters alone. And the engineering reflected this community thinking in one more way that most visitors never notice. Every gasshō-zukuri house in Shirakawa-go faces the same direction. They are all oriented north to south. This is not coincidence or tradition for tradition's sake. The north-south alignment minimizes wind resistance against the valley's prevailing gales and maximizes sun exposure on the long eastern and western faces. The sun melts snow off the thatch faster. The thatch dries more efficiently after rain, and the wind slides along the narrow gable ends instead of slamming into a broad face. Every house in the village follows the same orientation because the design only works if everyone cooperates. One house turned the wrong way would funnel wind into its neighbor. The engineering is communal because the survival is communal. In 1995, UNESCO designated the historic villages of Shirakawa-go and Gokayama as a World Heritage Site. The listing recognized not just the architecture, but the living cultural landscape, the Yui system, the agricultural practices, and the relationship between the built environment and the natural one. 59 gasshō-zukuri structures survive in Shirakawa-go's Ogimachi village. 20 more stand in Ainokura in Gokayama. Several are now minshuku, traditional guest houses where visitors can sleep on tatami mats, sit around a real Irori, and watch the snow pile up outside a 300-year-old window. Now here is the part that is hard to explain. Japan looked at this engineering tradition. Centuries of evidence that you could build warm, durable homes in extreme cold using local materials and community labor. And then, when the country industrialized and modernized, it built homes that are worse at staying warm than the ones it replaced. Modern Japanese houses are notorious for being cold in winter. This is not an exaggeration. And it is not limited to old buildings. Even new construction, stylish apartments in Tokyo, recently built houses in Osaka is frequently built with thin walls, minimal insulation, and aluminum window frames that conduct cold straight through the wall. Aluminum has roughly 1,000 times the thermal conductivity of wood. A single-pane aluminum window is essentially a hole in the wall with a piece of glass in front of it. Central heating, the kind of whole-house system that is standard in the United States, Canada, and most of Europe, barely exists in residential Japan. Most Japanese homes do not heat their hallways, bathrooms, or bedrooms at all. You heat whatever room you happen to be sitting in, and the rest of the house stays cold. The typical household uses kerosene space heaters, electric fan heaters, or the beloved kotatsu, A low table with a blanket and a heater underneath where you tuck your legs in and hope you do not have to get up anytime soon. Residents in some parts of northern Japan report waking up to indoor temperatures of 6 degrees Celsius, that is 43 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the house. The reason is partly cultural. Japanese architecture has traditionally prioritized ventilation over insulation. The humid, sweltering summers were considered a greater threat than the cold winters, and homes were designed to breathe. Walls were thin. Sliding doors opened entire walls to the outside air. Airflow was everything. The medieval essayist Yoshida Kenko wrote in the 1330s that a house should be built for summer because winter can always be endured. That attitude persisted for 700 years. And it produced a culture where being cold indoors in winter was considered normal. You did not heat the house. You heated yourself. You sat under a kotatsu. You wore layers. You endured. The Japanese phrase gamansuru, which roughly means to bear it, to persevere, applied to indoor temperatures the same way it applied to everything else. But culture only explains so much. The bigger factor is regulatory and economic. Japan has a scrap and build construction mentality. The average Japanese house is demolished after roughly 30 years, sometimes sooner. The land holds its value, but the building sitting on it depreciates rapidly, and many Japanese structures are torn down to make way for newer ones. When the building itself is treated as disposable, there is no financial incentive to invest in premium insulation. Why insulate a house that will not exist in 3 decades? On top of that, Japan's insulation guidelines went untouched for over 20 years. The standards set in 1999 stayed in place with no updates, no enforcement, and no requirement that builders actually follow them. The majority of new homes built during that period had no mandatory insulation standard to meet. Builders could and did put up houses with single-pane aluminum windows and walls that offered about as much thermal resistance as a windbreaker. As of 2024, Japan was the only G7 country that had not mandated compliance with energy efficiency standards for newly built houses. It was not until April of 2025 that the government finally required all new construction to meet at least a baseline insulation grade. And that regulatory gap has a body count. The heat shock problem, where sudden temperature changes between warm and cold rooms trigger strokes and cardiac events, kills thousands of people every year. In 2023, 6,073 people aged 65 and older drowned in bathtubs, at home or in residential facilities. The Consumer Affairs Agency estimates that the total number of bathing-related deaths, including those classified as illness rather than drowning, reaches somewhere between 17,000 and 19,000 annually. That is roughly 3 to 4 times the number of traffic fatalities in the same period. And here is the part that still doesn't make sense. The prefectures with the worst heat shock death rates are not in the coldest parts of the country. Hokkaido, the northernmost island, has the lowest bathtub drowning risk ratio of any prefecture, because homes there actually tend to have decent insulation, double-pane windows, and sometimes even central heating. The people of Hokkaido know their winters are dangerous, so they build accordingly. The worst death rates show up in warmer southern prefectures like Kagoshima, where people do not expect their homes to be dangerously cold and therefore do nothing to prevent it. Kagoshima's bathtub drowning risk ratio is more than 5 times higher than Hokkaido's. The research confirms it directly. A lower prevalence of double-pane windows in a prefecture correlates with higher bathtub drowning risk. The problem is not the weather, it is the walls. The irony is hard to miss. The farmers of Shirakawa-go, working with hand tools and grass and rope in the 1600s, designed a thermal system so effective that it kept silkworms alive through alpine winters. The fire in the floor preserved the roof. The roof insulated the fire. The community maintained both. 300 years later, one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth was building homes where an elderly person could freeze walking from the living room to the bathroom. A gasshō-zukuri house does not need electricity. It does not need gas lines. It does not need a thermostat, a furnace, ductwork, or a building inspector. What it needs is 3 feet of layered thatch, an open fire, and a village willing to show up when the roof wears out. And in exchange, it offers something that a modern Japanese apartment with aluminum windows and a kerosene heater cannot. A home where every room is part of the same thermal envelope, heated by the same source, maintained by the same cycle. The gasshō-zukuri builders understood something that modern construction ignored for decades. Warmth is not a feature you add to a building. It is a relationship between the structure, the fuel, and the people who maintain them. Break any part of that relationship, and the building fails. The Irori fails without the thatch. The thatch fails without the Irori, and both fail without the yui. Those farmhouses in Shirakawa-go, the ones shaped like praying hands, buried under snow every winter for 3 centuries and counting, were not primitive. They were complete. Every part served every other part. The roof shed the snow that would crush it. The fire preserved the roof that insulated it. The village maintained the roof that sheltered them. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was decorative. And nothing was optional. You could not remove the thatch without losing the Irori's preservation cycle. You could not remove the Irori without losing the warmth that kept silkworms alive and families together. You could not remove the yui without losing the ability to replace the roof at all. Pull one thread and the whole system unravels. Meanwhile, Japan's 2025 insulation mandate now requires 10-centimeter glass wool panels in walls and 20-centimeter panels in ceilings. That is the modern solution. Stuff manufactured insulation into the walls of a house that was never designed to hold heat, and hope that it works better than a 3-foot blanket of layered grass maintained by 200 neighbors who have been doing this since the 1700s. The gasshō-zukuri villages are often described as a living heritage, which is a polite way of saying they are old and we have moved past them. But the retention graphs of Japanese building performance suggest that maybe we moved past something we should have been paying closer attention to. Not the thatch itself, but the thinking behind it. The idea that a building should be designed as a system, not a collection of parts. That warmth is not something you buy from a utility company, but something you build into the bones of a structure. And that the people who live in a building are not separate from the building. They are part of how it works. If the engineering behind structures like these interests you, the video on screen covers another building tradition that modern architects are only now starting to understand. Click it, and I will see you there.